This is Free to Exchange, the show where free-thinking scholars, free markets, and, ironically, free public television all meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. Economic freedom is a topic near and dear to our hearts here on Free to Exchange. Our first guest is a scholar who's an expert in measuring it. He's going to tell us how U.S. states stack up against each other and why it matters. Preview: we rank pretty well here in Texas. But even if Texas is relatively free, we could certainly do better. On the second part of the show, our next guest will discuss ways that public policy in Texas could improve to make us all freer. My first guest is Dr. Joshua Hall. Dr. Hall is an associate professor of economics and the co-director of the Center for Free Enterprise at West Virginia University. He's also a co-author of the Economic Freedom of the World annual report. Josh, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
Well, Josh, we've discussed economic freedom here on the show before. In fact, we've even had your co-author, Bob Lawson, on talking about the study that you guys do every year. God, actually, we've had him on twice. He talked about Obamacare, too. So I don't want to go over old ground too much, but a new report has come out since I last had him on about this. And the story Bob was telling us was that the United States had been plummeting in economic freedom. We used to be the second freest country in the world back in 2000, and I think we had plummeted to like 17th. But I saw your new study. It says the United States is now number 12. Are we correcting ourselves? Are we becoming freer in the United States?
Well, Ben, that's the problem with rankings. Our ranking did improve to 12th, but it's really because other countries got worse than us faster. Not that we've really improved. So all the things that Bob probably talked about, increasing regulation, increasing barriers to trade, lack of respect for property rights, we haven't improved on anything like that. So you kind of got to look at the underlying scores to see really what's going on. And I guess in some ways, some really pessimistic person could, or I should say optimistic person should say, oh, we're not doing too bad. But all the trends still are pointing downwards.
Oh, man. I had seen it and I got cheered up a little bit. But that's actually an even worse story because, right, the story of the world since 1980 has been improving in economic freedom. Then we were dropping off as kind of the anomaly, but this tells me now the world is starting to go in the wrong direction too.
Yeah, and the sad thing is, we were probably expecting to see this kind of post-recession. A lot of countries went through the recession, kind of had the same kind of Keynesian policies that we follow in the United States. Obviously that affected our economic freedom rating, but we didn't really see that across a wide number of countries. So these are more kind of pervasive things, are really, you kind of want to think of as an affection in the kind of body politic. You're seeing these declines in rule of law, increasing regulation. Really worrisome things, because if you think about that increase in economic freedom, that's all easy stuff to fix. When we change marginal tax rates, right? Write down a different number on a piece of paper. But how do you get the people to want to respect property rights, not take from one person and give to another? That's a hard thing.
Right, that's a much harder process of reform. So just briefly before we get into U.S. states then, is the general feel of who's still at the top of freedom in the world the same? Who's at the bottom? What are these countries?
The top of the Economic Freedom Index, Hong Kong, Singapore. Many people will be surprised that Canada ranks above the United States, because we think one thing, healthcare, right?
Right.
But in many other ways, there are a lot.
Although we're headed that way.
Well, that's one thing nobody does particularly well on. But at the bottom, we have countries like Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Democratic Republic of Congo. You probably have other countries in mind, but we don't rank, like Cuba or North Korea. Pretty sure they're lower, but we just don't have good enough data to rank them. Okay,
so tell me then about, actually let's just define our concept first. Conceptually, what is economic freedom that we're trying to measure here? And I mean now at kind of the United States level, to compare Texas and New Mexico, say.
Yeah, so I like to think about somebody within that state, somebody, your average person in Texas or my home state of West Virginia. What are the constraints on their ability to go out and earn a living in the economic marketplace? So are there barriers to them working in labor markets, right? What sort of restrictions are there to getting gainful employment? Once they get employed, if they're lucky enough to get employed, how much income does government take in terms of taxes? What sort of regulations are on businesses? So somebody who wants to go and hire that person, how difficult is it to hire that person? So these indices look at taxation, they look at government spending, they look at government regulation.
Okay, so things then like that differ between states, like the minimum wage in one state versus another, or whether Texas doesn't have an income tax, but New Mexico or somebody else does.
That's all going to factor in. And so it's kind of taking a big picture. So, obviously states like Florida and Texas look pretty well if we only look at the income tax, but I heard some people grousing yesterday about property taxes. So all of those kind of taxes are factored in, and Texas still does very well. I think that not having an income tax really constrains the ability of the state to take a lot of income from its citizens. And so when we put all this together, we get a picture of kind of the most free states economically and the least free states economically.
Okay, so, well, I kind of actually blew it for you in the intro, but who are the most free states?
Well, Texas is right up there at the top. I'm sure that's no surprise to many of your viewers. We have other states, South Dakota, North Dakota, live free or die, state of New Hampshire would be at the top. At the bottom would be many of the states you probably wouldn't be surprised at, California, New York State, Maine. My home state of West Virginia is at the bottom. It's always been at the bottom. And I think if you just look, old professor of mine, Rich Vedder, I might have one of his books there. Yeah. He used to say can we see with our eyeballs, or does it make common sense? And if you think about those states, we have some pretty high income states. California, right? Not surprising. People love living on the coast. They love the weather. But look at my home state of West Virginia. This is the first year in the last 25 years that our state income has gotten to 80% of the U.S. average. So for every $100 that somebody in an average state makes, the average West Virginia makes $80. And we really think that economic freedom, lack of economic freedom is what's holding West Virginia back economically. And same would be true of Mississippi and other states at the bottom.
Yeah, as you say this, when you look at, your index for the world one of the most stunning pictures that you can have, right, is the Korean Peninsula at night and the difference between free and unfree, and it lit up. But there was a book that was published, I think it was called Unleashing Capitalism. And it was like why prosperity stops at the West Virginia border. And it was that same type of idea of businesses all around us, but then inside we're kind of not doing so hot. What was the stick in that book? Yeah,
it was it just kind of came from that picture of North Korea at night. And one my co-editor on the book, Russ Sobel, was kind of looking at the state through Google Maps and noticing that there's all this development right across the border. Now, it takes some really bad policies for businesses to say, no, I want something from this state. I either want, hey, they have good workers, right? Or they have, in the case of West Virginia, good natural resources. But no, I don't want to physically locate in that state. And so I'm going to set up shop in Maryland. I'm going to set up shop in Kentucky. I'm going to set up shop in Virginia. I'm just not going to do business in West Virginia. And that book really highlighted to policymakers in West Virginia, here are some of the dumbest policies that you're pursuing. Why do you have, look, states are going to raise revenue, but why are you going to have taxes that don't raise revenue and impede business activity? Right?
You mean that they were so steep that the activity ceased happening much, and that's why they didn't raise revenue?
Well, things like tax would be like so part of it's a steepness, part of it's like an inventory tax. Well, if we're going to tax businesses for how much inventory they have, businesses that have inventory are not going to locate in the state. So if you're a firm that has to kind of smooth production, let's say you're making paper for back to school. Mm-hmm. Well, you're going to sell a lot of time, and but you don't want to just hire a bunch of people and make paper, sell it, and let it go. You're going to build it up through the year. Well, you're not going to operate in West Virginia with that type of tax. And so it doesn't end up raising very much revenue, and it gets people leaving the state.
So I've seen all these studies for the world, this is a great story about West Virginia, I think it illustrates it well, but I've seen these economist studies about the world economic freedom and how they're more prosperous or people live longer. Do you find similar relationships? What are the type of areas that people find when they look at U.S. states like this?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ben, because we know the differences are so stark across countries. Like clearly, Cuba, nobody's, if we come to West Virginia, people aren't driving 53 Packards, right? So the difference between Cuba and Hong Kong are much greater than Maryland and West Virginia, right? And so we might be concerned that we're not going to see those big changes, and economic freedom is not going to matter much once we get inside a pretty homogeneous country like the United States. And so I went out with a couple of co-authors and looked at all the studies that use this Economic Freedom in North America report. And what did they find? They find the exact same thing you find at the international level. Higher incomes in more economically free states. You get about $7,000 difference between the most economically free state and the least economically free state in terms of per capita income.
Okay. And migration patterns too, because like we don't get to study that on the international level because there's all the barriers to migration, but we're free to move. I left Massachusetts and moved to Texas, and my income tax rate went way down. Do we find relationships like that?
We do. We see lots of people, economists like to use the phrase voting with your feet. And a lot of people who try to change policy in a particular state and just bang their head against the wall realize, okay, time for me to move to sunnier pastures, right? And so if you ask people, why did you move? Like you moved for the great opportunities here at Texas Tech, but certainly the reason you have great opportunities is because of economic freedom.
Sure, it was one of the factors that calculated in when you're looking at your adjusted cost of living and after-tax income. My little boy's got the sign on his room that says, I wasn't born in Texas, but I got here as soon as I could. What about other things, entrepreneurship or other things we might care about that vary by states like this?
Yeah, I see much higher rates of entrepreneurship. The funny thing is when you listen to politicians, they want to spin a story, right? So you'll see some surveys and say, here's the reason why people moved. And they'll always say jobs or employment. See, they're not moving for taxes. But what they're missing is why were jobs there? And so economic freedom lets entrepreneurs pick up those opportunities, those $20 bills on the ground, and go out and start businesses that then attract people, right? So if the conditions are right, what do people want? They want good schools, right? They want a nice place to live. They want good weather, and so those places that have that and then get the policy mix right are attracting both entrepreneurs. Those people currently living there are starting businesses, and they're getting new migrants.
So real quick, as we're starting to wrap up here, I know it's been taken down one more level too, where we've actually looked at metropolitan areas and the freedom there. And it's going on this year with San Francisco and Oakland putting in $15, $17 minimum wages, and you're seeing businesses close there. So they've started to rank the economic freedom of each metro area. How does that turn out?
What's pretty amazing about that is you see wide variation within a state. I think that for me that was the most shocking thing. Is a state like Texas. We know Texas has a lot of variation in it, it's just so big. But you have cities like, I think it's Tyler metropolitan area, that's 13th among the metro areas, and then you have others that are outside the 100. Right? I think Lubbock's 50th. And so you get real extreme.
Now, by 50th, you don't mean 50th in Texas. You mean 50th.
No, I mean
in the
50th
whole
in the whole
States.
United States among all metro. I think it's over 300 metropolitan areas that are ranked 50th among all 300 metropolitan areas. And so Texas, as you can think, one of the most free states, does very well. The most free city in West Virginia, my home city of Morgantown, is 322.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, I'm very happy to be at the Free Market Institute here in the relatively free Lubbock and the relatively free Texas. Josh, thanks for joining and talking about this with us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
People say everything's bigger in Texas. It appears our economic freedom's a bit bigger too. But given the sorry state of economic freedom throughout this country, surely we could do even better. Stick around and see how our next guest thinks that we could improve.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Vance Ginn. Dr. Ginn is an economist at the Center for Fiscal Policy at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Not too long ago, he earned his doctorate here in economics at Texas Tech University. Welcome back to Texas Tech, Vance.
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be back in my alma mater.
Yeah, and for the last couple years that you've been gone now, you've been working at Texas Public Policy Foundation doing this work on taxes there. So I moved from Massachusetts to Texas, so from Taxachusetts to Texas. And actually one of the things I looked at when I was moving was how much in taxes I was going to pay in Massachusetts versus here. And Texas was a big improvement. But there's still a lot more we could do, isn't there?
There certainly is. We like to call it the Texas model, where you have low taxes, no personal income tax, less regulation, and a sensible lawsuit climate. But the key here is having low taxes. As you mentioned, we have no personal income tax at all, focused primarily on a consumption, a sales tax of 6.25% for the Texas, and then the local communities can have up to 2%. So the maximum you can have is 8.25% in sales tax. But there's more that we can do eventually.
I don't like 8.2% getting stolen from me, frankly.
Yeah.
But it's better than what Massachusetts would do to me. So what, in terms of their economic impact, what are kind of the worst taxes that we have here in Texas?
The worst tax that we have really is what's called our franchise tax. It's our business margin tax.
What's franchise tax? What's that mean?
So it's basically a tax on businesses based on revenue, not on their profits. So it's a gross receipts tax. It's just a horrible way to tax businesses.
This makes no sense. So even if I'm making losses, but there's lots of revenue that comes in, my costs are bigger, I pay taxes on that revenue?
That's exactly right. If you make $1 million or more, there's a $1 million exemption. But if you make more than $1 million, you're going to pay this tax.
Not make more than, have
I'm
revenues
sorry,
of
revenues of more than $1 million. Exactly right. And so even if you have a net loss, you can still be paying this tax. So it pushes businesses further in the red instead of trying to have an economic environment that's conducive to more job growth.
Or it pushes them across a border to another state probably too, right?
Exactly right. Even though many jobs and individuals are moving to Texas, there are these impediments that are pushing them away at the same time. It's just something that we need to improve on here in Texas.
Sure. I mean, the whole point in economics, right? These are counterfactual examples. So Texas is doing great on lots of margins, and that makes up for some stupid policies. And this is one of those stupid policies that on the margin is pushing or preventing some businesses from coming here who would have otherwise come here probably, right?
That's exactly right. And as we know, businesses don't pay taxes. Consumers, individuals pay the cost of those taxes in the form of higher prices, reduced wages, and fewer jobs that are going to be created in the process.
And fewer goods and services to consume.
Exactly right.
So what can be done for tax reform here in Texas that would make us more productive, wealthier here?
So one thing we would do is eliminate the margin tax entirely. Get rid of this onerous, costly business tax.
Slice it out.
That's right.
That's a good start.
Have as few taxes as possible. Meet the needs of Texans, and we would say, hey, it needs to be fewer dollars being spent here in Texas already, so we need lower taxes in the process. But let's get rid of those that are the most onerous. One of those being the margin tax. Another one we consider to be too high of a tax burden are property taxes. So our long-term goal is to also eliminate property taxes and have a reformed sales tax. So it's basically a movement from business property taxes to a consumption tax here in Texas.
And why is a consumption tax better than a property tax?
So a consumption tax tends to be better.
Actually, I said better.
Yeah.
I didn't really mean better. Why is it maybe less bad?
That's a great way to put it. Less bad tax because it's broad-based. Everyone tends to pay a sales tax directly. Whether in property taxes, if it's paid by homeowners, we know that also is being paid by renters in the form of higher rent. But a sales tax, you see it on your receipt. It's more noticeable. And so therefore, it's more of a tax that's not as onerous as far as margin tax or property tax. So like you said, it's the least bad of these others.
Now, of course, the real game here is government spending. If we whittled the state government down to what its appropriate size would be, it really wouldn't matter which tax they chose because they'd be taxing us so little that it wouldn't distort our activity too much, right?
That's right, Ben. So what we would like to do at the Texas Public Policy Foundation is to have a strict spending limit. As we know, as Buchanan's work showed in Public Choice, is that politicians are going to do what's in their best interest, what makes them happy, get reelected. It's not necessarily what's making everyone happy across this great state of Texas or in other places across this nation. And so what we would do is have a strict spending limit that's not on just a portion of the budget like we have currently today. It's like 40% of the budget. So what they do is play a shell game and move it outside of the spending limit. So we say is let's cap the entire budget at maybe population growth plus inflation or different metrics that we could use that would hopefully hold it down over time. That way you can reduce taxes as much as possible.
So this would be like a constitutional rule?
Exactly right. It'd be a constitutional spending limit.
And do you think that would do a better job of keeping these guys in check?
I think it would, and there's research on this that shows that the more strict and stringent a spending limit is, the more it's able to keep them in line. Now, there is this opportunity for them to vote on, have a 2/3 majority vote to bust the limit. So they still try to find these ways around it. But we want to have as much teeth in this as possible so we can reduce spending and keep taxes low. Because that's really what's going to drive more economic growth and opportunity and prosperity for all Texans.
Yeah, and what we see when we look around the United States, right? Different state governments, the more narrow their tax base, the fewer different taxes they have, the smaller the spending tends to be. So usually in economics and public finance, they'd say the optimal type of taxation is we want a really broad base with lots of people so that we have the minimizing of the distortions. Yeah. But that's assuming a given level of spending. If these guys get away with doing that, they're just going to throttle us and spend more and more, right?
That's exactly right, yeah. And that's the reason why we want to limit spending. I think that's the primary objective, is to limit spending. And then that way we can work on lowering taxes and getting rid of taxes in the process.
Right. I mean, a lot of people who like free markets think of like a Reagan revolution in the United States, and they're like, look what he did to limit government, but what really happened?
Large budget deficits, more spending, whether it be defense or other areas of the budget. And so, yeah, they were able to cut taxes dramatically. The top rate went from 70% down to 28%, but you had a large amount of spending in the process, leading to more deficits, which just means higher taxes in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, basically, free market support doesn't mean just cutting taxes. It means shrinking the size and scope of government.
Yes, and that's what that's what I'm really trying to do, is find ways that will reduce the footprint of government. And by doing so, whether it's a spending limit restraint or that will then allow us to cut taxes. I mean, that's the approach that we're looking at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And just the business tax alone, like I said earlier, this business margin tax is driving jobs away from Texas that otherwise would be here. We've done a great job since the Great Recession, right? June 2009, I mean, go back to December 2007. In Texas alone, we've added 1.4, 1.5 million jobs, but most of the rest of the nation is just now getting back to where they were back in December 2007. And so much of the job growth has been in Texas. It's not just based on oil, but just based on the overall economic environment of providing more prosperity.
We are one of the more economically free states in the United States, although I think this is like being the tallest dwarf, because I think our freedom should be much, much larger here. So one thing that you mentioned about the taxes and why Texas Public Policy Foundation favors moving to a consumption tax is that it's explicit, it's on your bill. And I was thinking of how when Obamacare passed, some businesses started putting Obamacare tax essentially on people's receipts, and people would get mad about it. So much of our taxation is hidden. People don't get mad. So I've got an idea for you. See, and you don't have to speak for TPPF on this. Okay. How about tax reform at the national level? We just charge everybody a head tax for being alive, and they have to pay it in full just once a year on the second Monday of November.
Yeah, just for being alive. Yeah, it's something to consider. But I mean,
you can't distort the behavior very much unless you're going to commit suicide.
Right.
So you're still going to get the same economics. It's very visible.
Yeah.
And you pay it right before an election.
Yeah.
What do you think that would do to the size and scope of government?
They would have greater incentive to understand what their government's doing before they go to the ballot box. That's for sure. And hopefully reduce the size and scope of government over time.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the big thing, right? How do we reduce the size and scope of government? I think constitutional amendments and stuff like that is a good start. It raises the cost of politicians doing some things differently. But ultimately, it's the hearts and minds of citizens in Texas and around the country, right, that are going to limit the size and scope of government or not.
Yes, and it gets at the problem that Hayek talked about with the knowledge problem of having this government entity think that they know what's best for their citizens, when we're the ones that know best. Individuals can decide what they want to do with their money better than some government entity. And so the more that we can put power in the hands of the people, that's where it needs to be.
Power to the people.
That's right.
All right, guns up. You heard it from a Texas Tech grad here. Thanks for joining us, Vance.
Thank you, Ben.
Well, today was kind of a good news, bad news day on the show. Bad news was that the improvement in the economic freedom ranking of the United States isn't really an improvement in freedom. It's just other people getting worse. Good news is, in Texas, we're freer than any of the other states in the United States, and right here in Lubbock, we do pretty good among the metropolitan areas in the United States. And hopefully, people will take to heart some of the advice from our second guest on the show of how we could improve and become even freer here in Texas. See you next time.